And here I thought Marvin the Martian was a bad ref. Hey everybody, welcome to Mainly Movies. Today I'm going to be talking about the 2021 sports comedy sequel, Space Jam: A New Legacy. If you're new here, please consider subscribing for a variety of movie-related content like reviews, ranked lists, and trailer reactions. All my reviews include a breakdown of the pros and cons, my rating, and some tailored film recommendations, so be sure to watch through to the end of this video for all that extra content. Space Jam: A New Legacy stars LeBron James, Don Cheadle, and Cedric Joe, and was directed by Malcolm D. Leigh. It tells the story of LeBron James, who, after being sucked into the Warner Brothers serververse along with his son, must win a basketball game, with the help of the Looney Tunes, in order to earn their freedom. Before we can even get into talking about this sequel, we have to first briefly address the original Space Jam. It's one of those movies that's very difficult to explain, just because of how bizarre it was. It had an incredibly strange premise and an absurd mixture of ideas that somehow became a pop culture phenomenon, at least for kids at the time. And watching it now, it's basically a time capsule. The music, the humor, the references, the overall style, it's the 90s distilled into a strange Looney Tunes basketball movie. And when viewed as a time capsule, it still kind of works as a movie. But without that context, and especially without some sort of nostalgia, it just doesn't make any sense. So where does that leave a sequel coming out 25 years later? Space Jam: A New Legacy takes a sort of unexpected approach to sequelhood. It uses the original film as a springboard, taking the name and the most basic elements of the plot, you know, an NBA star playing basketball with the Looney Tunes, but other than that, it's very much its own thing. Whereas the first film was mostly a Michael Jordan showcase, this one tries to have a little bit more of a story for the non-Looney Tunes basketball component. There's some family stuff, with a focus on father-son relationships, and some classic family film lessons that the characters learn over the course of the movie. And so by adding more depth to the framing device, things make a little more sense and are slightly more coherent and better paced this time around. A New Legacy feels like it has more of a complete story, but it's still pretty bare bones and doesn't really elevate anything. So this sequel is definitely its own thing, but is that really what this movie should have been? I know that people generally like to scoff at the idea of fan service and sequels really leaning into people's nostalgia for an earlier movie. There's always a hope and a call for an original story in a case like this. But what if you get that more original story without much nostalgia and it's very lackluster? What are you left with then? And that leads me to another question I have about this movie. Who is this film made for? Now, I guess the obvious answer, just like it was in 1996 with the original, is kids. This is a very chaotic film, and so I imagine that most kids will have a decent time with the frenetic style, the slapstick humor and pop culture references, and the video game-centric plot. But that still doesn't quite answer my question. They could have made an original standalone movie with all of those elements, so why Space Jam 2? It's not like there was some resurgence and kids today are really into the original Space Jam. Most probably had never even heard of it before this movie was announced. So it seems obvious, to me at least, that they were really trying to go after the 30-something-year-olds who grew up with the original and have that positive nostalgic connection to its ridiculousness. So why not lean into that nostalgia? Now, there are definitely some callbacks, Easter eggs, and minor references to the original movie. The intro and opening title sequence is kind of reminiscent. There are a handful of "why does this sound familiar" jokes, and a really good gag at halftime that actually made me laugh out loud, but I was honestly expecting and hoping for a lot more. Maybe I'm in the minority for wanting that degree of fan service from this movie, but given the lackluster story, it didn't have nearly the nostalgia boost that it needed. But what about the ideas that do carry over from the first film? Like I said, this movie does still use the basic premise of mixing live action and animation so the Looney Tunes can play basketball with an NBA star. So let's talk about the Looney Tunes and animation here. It's probably no surprise, but there's quite an improvement over the original when it comes to the hybrid visual style. This movie actually blends live action with both 2D and 3D animation, and for the most part, it looks pretty good. The Looney Tunes themselves are very fun here. The jokes seem a bit reined in, though the jabs at LeBron's team jumping were pretty funny, but from a visual gag perspective, they had the bonkers zaniness that you would expect. On the human character side, things were a bit more mixed. LeBron James was actually pretty decent in the role. He was certainly much less wooden than Michael Jordan in the first film, but we also have to keep in mind that LeBron has appeared and acted in a few other films before. I mean, he's not going to be winning any Oscars for this performance, but it worked, and he was very good with his frequent confused expressions every time the Looney Tunes did something crazy. It also seemed like he was having a good time with it, and so there's this added cool factor to it, knowing that since he's only a few years older than I am, he probably watched the original Space Jam as a kid, so this had to be a surreal experience for him. Cedric Joe, who plays LeBron's son, was fine in the role, and almost all of the other human characters had very minimal roles in the framing device of the story. But we do have one other human actor playing a not really human role. Although he mostly appears in human form during the movie, Don Cheadle plays Algae Rhythm, the oh-so-creatively named algorithm in charge of the Warner Brothers servers. Like LeBron, it seemed like Cheadle had a good time with this role, and I have a feeling most people are probably going to enjoy the character, but he was very off-putting to me. I mean, he's the villain, so obviously we're not really supposed to like him, but he was just a little too over the top for me. I have to say, though, I was a little surprised and intrigued by aspects of this character's introduction, because it really seemed like Warner Brothers was poking fun at themselves, and maybe this very movie, but it didn't really come across as super self-aware, so it felt more like something that somebody slipped in as a jab that somehow made it through to the final cut. Speaking of Warner Brothers, we've got to talk about the serververse. If you saw any of the trailers for this movie, you know that the story takes place within the servers that house all of the movies and TV shows owned by Warner Brothers. And this is visually illustrated by these different IPs existing on their own planets or worlds within the serververse. So I gotta say that this was a very interesting idea and had a lot of potential due to the sheer number of IPs that Warner Brothers controls. And there was some fun to be had with this, because we do get to briefly explore some of these worlds. I don't want to spoil that for anybody, because it's probably the best segment of the movie, but I will say that a certain Wile E. Coyote moment was the other time during this movie that I actually laughed out loud. But as I suspected, the hundreds of characters we saw in the trailers don't really have a significant role in the movie, and serve more as background Easter eggs than anything else. Much like the original Space Jam, this sequel leaves me slightly baffled. It's a movie whose existence doesn't really make much sense, and while that was somehow lightning in a bottle in the 90s, I don't see the sequel garnering the same type of cult following. Certainly not from fans who grew up with the original film, and even 25 years from now, when kids today are adults looking back on the sequel, I really don't think that they're gonna have the same fondness for this movie that I and so many other 90s kids have for the original now. A New Legacy is an okay movie. I don't think it ever nailed down its target audience, but it's not bad. It just suffers from the fact that Space Jam, as a concept, is very much a you had to be there type of thing. So transplanting it into the 2020s without heavily leaning into the nostalgia just wasn't gonna work. Alright, let's talk about the pros and cons. The biggest pro here has gotta be the Looney Tunes. They were very entertaining in the traditional Looney Tunes type of way. I think if you're a fan of those cartoons and these characters, you're gonna really appreciate what's done with them here, because it feels like it's done in a very classic style. For a movie, it's almost confusingly chaotic, because they can literally do anything at any time, but they have plenty of fun with that, especially with some comments that LeBron makes as he incredulously watches some of their antics. I also really enjoyed the sequence where we see some overlap between the Toons and other Warner Brothers IPs, because it was fun to see their looniness pop up in other contexts. On the con side, the biggest issue was the lack of a clear target audience. This is a movie that wants to appeal to both kids and nostalgic adults, but doesn't quite capitalize on either segment of the audience. It's definitely an entertaining film. It's extremely frenetic and constantly has multiple things happening at the same time. So much so that it's almost a sensory overload, and there are times when you don't really know where you should be looking because there are just so many things going on. So it'll be engaging for kids in that way, but they won't get anything out of it in terms of it being a Space Jam movie. But aside from a handful of references and Easter eggs, it doesn't really play up the nostalgia very much. So there's not a ton to draw in existing Space Jam fans either. I mean, we came to slam and to jam, and didn't even get the theme song. Con number 2 is Algae Rhythm. So I have a feeling that I'm probably going to be in the minority on this, but I did not like this character at all. There was no nuance to him, and he was just a very basic and over-the-top villain. It's not like Swackhammer and the Nerdlucks were anything amazing in the first movie, but this character was especially grating. His motivations were kind of obnoxious, and he was just a constant source of over-obvious exposition. Cheadle's performance was fine, I just really disliked the character. Before I give you my rating and recommendations, I want to remind you that if you're interested in buying Space Jam: A New Legacy or any of the other films I mentioned today, I do have affiliate links for all of them in the description below. I get a small commission from anything you buy using one of my links, so I'd really appreciate it if you use them if they're marked for any of these movies. I'm gonna give Space Jam: A New Legacy 2.5 out of 5 paws. As a visually stimulating, video game-inspired Looney Tunes romp through Warner Brothers IPs, it's decent, but as a Space Jam sequel, it's a bit of a letdown. I would recommend Space Jam: A New Legacy to fans of LeBron James or anybody looking for a kinda chaotic, Easter egg-filled WB crossover movie. Looney Tunes fans will enjoy portions of this movie, but I don't think most fans of the original Space Jam will have a ton to grab onto here. It's okay, but doesn't lean into the nostalgia all that much, so I think Space Jam fans will range from sorta mixed to very underwhelmed by this one. If you liked Space Jam: A New Legacy, I've gotta recommend the original Space Jam. It's a weird movie, but if you like this, it's probably the type of weird you'd like. The very basic premise is the same as this sequel, but it's a bit more basketball focused, quite a bit shorter, and somehow makes even less sense. But it's all the better for it. If you liked seeing all of the characters from other movies and want another overly visually stimulating film that offers something similar, you should check out Ready Player One, which is a reference and Easter egg bonanza. And if you want to stick with Warner Brothers specifically and are interested in another new take on an old IP, you might want to watch Scoob. It lays the groundwork for a cinematic universe of sorts and is another occasionally entertaining, chaotic film with an unclear target audience. Alright, a couple questions for you guys. Number 1, have you seen Space Jam: A New Legacy? If so, what'd you think of it? And number 2, what's your favorite movie that stars a real-life athlete? Be sure to leave your answers in the comments below so we can get a discussion going. Alright, so if you got some enjoyment, insight, or information out of this review, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit that like button. And if you haven't done so already, please hit subscribe while you're at it to see more videos like this. Till next time, this has been Alyssa with Mainely Movies. The way life should be.